With my experience in the last few years working in the areas, we're looking at indigenous health research, we're looking at development, resource development in communities, looking at political systems. There are two key things I think that are generally missed and difficult for people to kind of wrap their heads around. One is the political identity side of it, is that indigenous people in Canada are nations within Canada. But even within is tricky because citizenship in Canada is not an assumption we can make. And I think that's something that people, when you say that, they're like, what? It's like, no, indigenous people have, there's indigenous nationhood. And this is something we need to, the rights that indigenous people have are not by virtue of them being citizens within a state called Canada. These are inherent rights that precede the development of the state. So we need to consider that, as it's not a minority group of Canadian citizens that we're dealing with nations. To me, it's a matter of understanding what colonialism is and what settler colonialism is first, and then we can learn how to decolonize from that. So it makes sense to me to kind of start from the bigger picture of colonialism generally. And there's kind of I think most people understand colonialism as kind of a very basic, you have an external colonial entity that comes in and dominates, exploits a particular region, people extracting wealth for their own benefit. I think that's a very standard kind of dictionary definition of colonialism. And in a lot of cases that's absolutely correct, but it doesn't get us very far in terms of understanding our context here and in Canada and what decolonization might look like. And in that sense, I think settler colonialism as a specific type that functions a little bit differently is important to be aware of and understand. Patrick Wolfe, who he passed away a couple of years ago now, but he was really at the forefront of sort of explaining settler colonialism as a different kind of practice. And you look at Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand as kind of the usual suspects. So where you would have places like India or South Africa, for example, those would be, I think, kind of standard examples of colonialism. You have an external entity that comes in and generally administers. But when you get to a post-colonial point, there's always those entities kind of go back home, you know, and then there's that the post-colonial era where the original inhabitants of those places retake control of their systems and their governance and economy, that sort of thing. One of the key things in explaining settler colonialism is that and to use their jargon, is the exogenous entity comes in and reproduces itself in a given place. And in order to do that, that entity must destroy to replace. And this is where it gets quite harsh, but it needs to be understood that and Patrick Wolfe talks about the logic of elimination. So we talk about the whole logic of the colonial elimination of indigenous peoples on this land. And we have like the sort of overt genocide at the early stages, moving towards, you know, residential schools and cultural genocide. And now in the modern, like contemporary age, we still have a denigration and even destruction of indigenous cultures and ways of life. So that is continuing. And when you think about a colonial entity destroying to replace, you got to think about all the institutions. We have economic institutions, political institutions, legal institutions, health institutions, education institutions. These are all the Western institutions that are being reproduced in this place. And we need to recognize that indigenous nations had those institutions, just not in the same kind of structure that we were familiar with, right? So that the fact that indigenous people here in Canada generally need to access Western institutions is testament to the fact that colonialism here is ongoing. And I think that's one of the key points, is that we understand colonialism as something that happened in the past, which it did, but the fact that it is ongoing, I think, is very important to understand.